Welcome to the Play Inspire Unite podcast. I'm your host, Ben Rycroft. We're doing something similar again today. We're going to be talking to one of our keynote speakers for the Ontario Soccer Summit, February 21st to 23rd at Redeemer University in Hamilton. We're joined by Dr. Norm O'Reilly today, an expert in sport marketing and business. He's going to give us a ton of insights into how soccer's doing against other sports, how it's doing from a business perspective, how it's doing from a marketing perspective, and most of all, give us some takeaways as to how your club, how your academy can actualize all this data that he's got. Super smart guy, really interesting conversation. If you haven't got them yet, go get your tickets, ontariosoccer.net right now, and come right back after that, and we'll be joined by Dr. Norm O'Reilly. Dr. O'Reilly, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Ben, for having me.
Why don't we start by discussing what you think are some of the trends that we're going to see emerge in sport and marketing and business in 2020? What are some of the things that people should be looking out for?
Well, it's quite interesting. If we look at it first from kind of a Canadian level, in Canada in 2018, 2019, we saw some real massive shifts in the business side of sport, the sponsorship side of sport, some very positive indicators. Brands are spending more on things like activation, more effective experiential marketing. They're getting smarter with their dollars. So sport properties, like all properties, really have to respond. So we've seen some very positive indicators in Canada around bringing some dollars from our corporate community to sport. Globally and in Canada, we're seeing a lot of challenges as well. I mean, we're dealing with this world where spectator sport is flat. Now, that flat is because if you're either the big sports are doing really, really well, more and more people, tickets are more expensive to the NHL and the EPL and these kind of events, yet the second tier down is struggling to sell tickets, whether it's an NLL or a CFL or these kind of organizations. And then the real scary area, as a lot of us know, is there are participation numbers. Even sports like soccer, which have always been the biggest ones and growing, are seeing pressure on their numbers. Hockey is under massive pressure and is seeing numbers go down year over year right now in terms of their participation. If it wasn't for girls, hockey would be in a real trouble area in terms of the number of boys that are playing. And that's overall. We're seeing Canadians are getting lazier. They're not being as active. They're not getting involved in sport. There's screens. Sport's not fun. There's a lot of things they can do with their time. And so from a participation perspective, it's really challenging. So you've got this mix of really interesting stuff, really exciting stuff, challenging stuff, and declining stuff. And then within that, if you compare sport to other competitive offerings, so when a brand or an individual is looking to do things with their time or their money, sport is competing against anything that's entertainment related. Going to the movies, going out, video games, and everything kind of in between. And so in that whole ecosystem, there's some really, really challenging and powerful competitors coming up to traditional sport, not the least of which is esports.
You have a depth of analytical knowledge and data pretty much unsurpassed anywhere else in sport. I wonder if you can just sort of tap into that for a second and speak to us about that participation number that you were just describing now. What are some of the key indicators that you've seen as to why we're seeing declines in participation of amateur sport?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a troubling one, both as someone who's devoted my life to sport and also as a father of four and someone who spends a lot of time on the board of Participation. I'm on the research advisory board of CAUSE, and so I've spent a lot of time looking at these studies, doing these studies. We do a lot of work, and it's very, very clear that, and it's not just us, it's any country that's developed around the world is the same issue. And we, Canada and the United States, are the worst. Our populations are now the least active anywhere in the world. We work the most. We have a lot of money. We have a lot of other things we like to do, which doesn't involve physical activity. Now, there's a sliver of people say, what are you talking about? I'm super active. There's a sliver of our population that's gone, about 10%, that's gone really, really crazy and does your CrossFits, or in my case, I do triathlons and Ironmans, and people go to the gym. So there's this part of the population that's spending a ton and going crazy. And there's about 40% of us that are doing some level, and then about half of Canadians, and it gets higher when you get into female populations, higher when you get into older populations, that are doing basically nothing, or just a very little bit, but not enough to maintain health. And so whether this is data from StatsCan or FAC, which is the Physical Health Activity Council of Canada, there's a lot of different groups that are looking at this. Their numbers are very, very strong. We're on this decline. I've done some research where I've got to dig into some certain sports, and I'm going to dig into soccer much more closely before the talk coming up. So I'm very excited to share that. But for example, in hockey, if you look at the indicators to your questions, overall, you've got a couple of things. One is you've got this general decline. People, adults are worse than youth, but across the board, doing physical activity. That's because they don't have as much interest from schools. Many schools are offering programs. Their friends aren't doing it. There's a lot of alternative stuff. Parents are too busy. Two-parent households. You go down the list. There's a whole bunch of barriers that are at that kind of level. So we've got this general decline. Then within that, we've got decline specific to the sport. So hockey is one of the ones that's seen a larger hit simply because it's a little more expensive. It's harder to get to. Some people view it as violent. There's concern about concussions. There's a number of these factors at play. We've also learned from our research that parents don't want to travel more than 15 minutes to take their kids to play something. So if you're in a league that's traveling all over the place, yeah, some parents are willing to put their life on hold, but not like our parents did and grandparents did for some, and were willing to just put their lives in sacrifice for their kids. If it's a big deal, they're not going to do that much anymore. So there's all these shifting kind of dynamics. That's made it really, really hard for sport. And then the last level, which I mentioned a little bit earlier in the first question, is at the level of the individual. And we have so many choices with our time. No one is bored anymore. That's gone. Nobody is bored. Your worst case scenario is you've got your favorite things to do on your favorite screen device, whatever time of day it is. It's not like when I was a kid when you sat around and waited for something to do. So you're competing against that when you're any kind of offering. You're trying to convince a kid to come join your club, trying to convince a parent to sign your kid up for your travel team, whatever the case may be. That set is really, really strong, and the substitutes are very, very many.
So scaling to an audience is super important, and a lot of people at this event are going to be from community leaders, community clubs, academies, technical directors, fans of the game. What can they expect to hear from you that they can take back to their organizations that is something that they will be able to tangibly hold on to and have an impact in their communities?
Yeah, thank you for that. For someone like me, obviously you don't have the sex appeal of someone who's working for 2026 or someone who's a former player. What someone like myself provides is content, and really business related content. And the way it will be framed is around resource and revenue and sponsorship generation, which is really the core of what I do. So the idea is to help athletes, clubs, other organizations in soccer, whoever's there from the representatives, understand these challenges, these barriers, but also spend a lot of time talking about what you can do, what kind of things need to be changed, how we target these groups, what kind of offerings we have to do, how sponsorship can work to attract somebody to a smaller property. And there's some as I mentioned up front, there's some very positive trends out there for certain properties, small ones, local ones, very grassroots oriented ones. Soccer's got a lot of very positive things happening out there. Global level, we're going to talk about shifts and where soccer fits amongst all the entertainment. We've got some wonderful data from 18 countries around the world they're going to share, these longitudinal kind of Canadian studies, and then some other research I'm going to pull in. So that's the whole idea, is to kind of outline what's going on, what's happening, what are the trends, but then the last part, to translate it, and okay, how do you use this to drive resources and success for your particular organization or individual, if you happen to be an athlete or a coach.
So one of the things I often hear from soccer people, and maybe it's sport people in general, well, they'll look at people who are within their sport and say, I can learn from that person. But if they're not from that sport, they sort of dismiss them out of hand sometimes, which is silly, obviously, because there's similarities across all sport. You've worked at the committee level, the grassroots level, the board level, across multiple different dimensions of sport and sport itself. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what do we see that's similar between soccer and other sports that we can learn from in those respects?
Yeah, it's a great point, and in the business world, they call that myopia, right? And it's a very poor view. It's like saying, there's great examples from business of Kodak and Blockbuster that no longer exist because they got very myopic and they didn't look at the broader things around them. And the same thing can happen in a sport, right? You think, sport is fine, and you realize, well, if you're a sport right now that most of your participants are late teenagers, you haven't noticed much because you've still got a lot of the baby boom echo and a big demographic shift there. But the next 3 or 4 years are being followed by my kids, the kids of Gen X, the next gen, very, very small generation. So if you don't have this broader view, so that's not just soccer and sport, that's everything. So what the lens that I will bring to your question is not just soccer versus hockey or soccer versus basketball or soccer versus tennis, but it's soccer in the case of any entertainment option from the perspective of those that are participating, and even broader from generating resources from brands around sponsorship and those kind of supports from anything that they could sponsor. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a Molson or a BlackBerry or any of these companies that are going to invest Nike in sport in Canada, they're not thinking about, am I gonna sponsor the Toronto FC or the Montreal Impact? They're looking at anything, arts. They're looking at charities. They're looking at parks. They're looking at municipalities. They're looking at festivals. They're looking at everything under that. When they think we've got some business objectives we want to achieve, we want to sell more of this brand of shoe to women 50 plus, or we want to sell X to this, we want to change our image with this particular group. They're looking at the whole range. So it's a very scary mistake, to your question. I think it's exactly what you were getting at, to try to focus just on your sport and not consider where it falls elsewhere. And you see a lot of this with kids and participation, and coaches and sports and clubs that get it are letting kids do lots of different things, participate in things, but there's still very old school thinking in some places where they force kids. Hey, if you want to be on my soccer team, you can't play hockey, or you can't do this, or can't. And so all those mentalities, if you want to generate these kind of things, we're going to talk about it in a very holistic, overall environment. And part of that's just pure basic business strategy, right? Is understanding what industry are you in and who are you competing against and who are substitutes for what you're offering. And that takes you immediately out of soccer.
A lot of the community leaders in that room are going to be people who are responsible for budgets, people who are responsible for bringing in marketing dollars in some instances. And I'm sure the question is going to come up, how do I get one of those blue chip brands that you were just mentioning to pay attention to my local community club? How can I get some of those dollars revenue into our system?
Yeah, and we're going to share lots about that. And as you can imagine, it's not easy. And often it's a case with very small properties of building some assets to try to drive interest and provide something of value. Now, clearly, and I'm the team manager of one of my son's travel teams, and you get people that donate some money, but often it's just a donation, right? It's a parent who's on a company or has access to a friend, and they say, hey, we'll give you $500 from our insurance company. Lovely. The insurance company's not expecting a return on that investment. They're really looking at it as a donation. They may call it sponsorship. But to your question, we're looking at real live sponsorship, and I'll talk a lot about this in the presentation. These are these positive trends. Canadian brands are looking for partners that provide them an opportunity to achieve their objectives. So the very successful properties that get lots of sponsorship provide that back. You say, well, it's only the Leafs and the Habs and the Canadian Olympic Committee. Nobody else gets anything in MLS. Not true. We see this bimodal distribution of the $3 billion that's spent in sponsorship in Canada, where one end is the big properties and the other end is the small one. So there's this real interesting dynamic where brands want national reach. You think of why you would sponsor the NHL in Canada or a Winter Classic or the COC or the Canadian Paralympic Committee. But a lot also want real grassroots. So we've learned that they want a chance to get their product. So you and I have a better chance to buy a Nissan if we test drive it at a CFL game than if we just look at a rink board of it. By infinite, and there's tons of research to support that. We have more likelihood to switch to Sobeys as our grocery store over Loblaws if we go to an activation at the Rogers Cup where we get to go and try some of their food and experience some of their stuff and interact with some of their staff, because that's called experiential. So that's what we want. Those are the two things that work. And there's a few properties in soccer that are going to be there that have that ability. Think about your provincial associations, your national, obviously Soccer Canada, big events, things around FIFA 2026, all these things. They have a chance to attract that national reach, and they have television audiences and massive social media following, and Cristiano Ronaldo is going to be there, and all this kind of stuff is going to be very attention drawing. But that's only one half. The other half is these smaller ones, like what Tim Hortons famously does with hockey. Get in there, right? And you do with soccer, what BMO has done with soccer and others. You get in there and you get into the grassroots, and parents get connected, and it's driving people to select their bank accounts differently. or their coffee differently, or whatever the case may be. And so you've got to really think, and that's a very long answer to your question, but this is the area I do most of my research, is you got to really think about what am I offering to them so that they're going to get what they gave me and more back in terms of driving their business and what they want to achieve. And I'll spend a lot of time talking about that. And it can be a long road for some, it can be a short road for others, but it's definitely something you have to be strategic about and move away from the thought of donations and towards an approach of true sponsorship.
You touched on it a little bit just a moment ago, but you and I were also talking before this. You've got some really interesting data as it relates to soccer and how soccer is doing relative to other sports. Can you give us a little taste of what that looks like and what people will hear about at Ontario Soccer Summit?
Yeah, I'm not going to give too much of that away because that's good. But I can tell you it's a good story. And we've done an initial cut of the data. This is the partnership with IMI. We've done an initial cut of the data of 11 countries, and now we'll have 18. And are very excited to present that. And it looks at huge populations, just general market, so not sport fans, general market in all these countries, and where sport falls amongst a variety of different things, what the trends are going. And as I said up front, there are some challenging trends overall with spectator sport, flat, and participation sport on a real decline. But soccer is faring very, very well. The athletes in soccer are, as you know, are some of the most powerful in the world. The big leagues and the Premier Leagues are doing exceptionally well. The MLS is on the rise, and pretty soon, and we're already starting to talk to them with the big 5 leagues in North America versus the big 4 in MLS. So there's a lot of really, really positive trends, and I'll contextualize a lot of that. And they say, well, what does that mean for me if I'm working for my local club in Richmond Hill or wherever I'm from, where I work for Ontario Soccer? Well, it does, and we're going to show how those kind of things can kind of filter down, how they can kind of work, and how we can leverage that kind of stuff. Because these are the things that kids and young people are really driving their decisions, right? Like you think about, we have, as older people, we have a very different view of how sport is consumed than our younger generations, who really it's part of an overall experience, and a lot of that experience is digital. So if there's some soccer, whether it's a FIFA video game or whether it's a chance to interact and share things on their social media with their goals and their games and their team, and these things are all getting intertwined, and we have a lot of cases of very traditional structures and how kids engage with our teams, and they just don't. The idea of a telephone or a text is irrelevant to young people, right? And so how do you start moving so we fit into that, and then you can consume part of what you love, the higher, like the Ronaldos, the Messis, the Team Canadas, all these groups you're following, but have that kind of flow down into your regular playing, and to use that as a driver for participation. And that's a very challenging thing. In a lot of cases, it's failed to take spectator interest into participation interest. And the way we deal with it, and I'll spend some time talking about this as well, is there are separate approaches. So one of the big mistakes a lot of us make in sport is we assume that if someone participates, they'll also spectate, and vice versa. Not true. There's the odd person that's like that, but the vast majority of those are mutually exclusive decisions, and you need separate strategies for both. And I'll build into that on the day, depending on the level that the organization is at, and just manifest it in some different ways.
That's super interesting. So let's end on this then. If someone's on the fence about attending Ontario Soccer Summit, February 21st to 23rd at Redeemer College in Hamilton, why don't you give them your elevator pitch as to why they should come see you, why they should come participate in Ontario Soccer Summit?
Well, I mean, I'll say one thing, irrespective of me, of course, at first, is there's some really exceptional speakers that are tied into 2026, which is, feverish for any of us in sport in Canada. It's going to be very, North America, really. It's going to be very, very exciting. There's some wonderful panelists. And I think what I will bring to the table, and what academics bring to the table, and what I think I've been well received before doing, is content. And so if you want content, and one of the things we often get at talks and the feedbacks you get, and I'm on a number of groups and conferences, et cetera, is like, hey, that was a great talk, but I didn't learn anything. With me, it'll be the opposite. You'll probably say there's too much stuff, but I promise you'll learn something. And I promise you have tons of content. One of the great things about academics and academic research is we share the data. Like often you go to an industry presentation, they may give you some neat strategy stuff, but they're not allowed to share the data, or it's confidential for their organization, or whatever the case may be. I will give you a lot of content, a lot of data, and a lot of stuff that you can take back and use in pursuing sponsorship and talent identification and trying to raise your participation numbers and retain members on your team, your club, those kind of pieces, etc.
It's been Dr. Norm O'Reilly. Sir, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Ben. My pleasure.
Thank you again to Dr. Norm O'Reilly for joining us here today. Excellent insight and a little bit of a taste as to what's coming to Ontario Soccer Summit. If you haven't got your tickets yet, head over to ontariosoccer.net right now. Purchase yours. It's going to be an excellent opportunity for development across multiple different dimensions of sport. Referees, match officials, coaches, administrators. It's an event you're not going to want to miss. For Dr. Norm O'Reilly, I'm Ben Rycroft, encouraging you to invest in your development and remember always to play, inspire, and unite.